So, namaskar friends and welcome once again. Continuing our discussion on emotional intelligence. I said first of all we will try to understand what do we mean by being emotionally intelligent. Now that we have understood what do we mean by emotional intelligence, it is also important for us how we can cultivate it. Well, knowing something is not important unless and until we understand how to make use of that. Well, we gather lot of information, but unless and until we know how to make judicious use of that information, it does not become part of our knowledge. And that is why a discussion on emotional intelligence will not be complete unless and until we understand how to cultivate it. So, friends, I intend to talk about mindfulness and self-regulation. So, let us talk about one of the defining crises of contemporary life. It is not simply stress, but the fragmentation of attention itself. We inhabit an age of constant notifications, algorithmic distraction, emotional overstimulation, doom scrolling, compulsive checking, instant reaction and chronic comparison. We are living in a world where our attention itself is fractured. It is so difficult to really take care of that. The mind is repeatedly pulled outward before it has time to inhabit its own center. We hardly get time to consume some information before the next information comes to us. How does this information overload act on our mind? The critical point is that modern digital culture has externalized this restlessness into systems designed to monetize distraction. Attention is no longer merely a personal faculty, it is a contested social resource. So, there are competing claims on your attention. As a result, you have crisis of attention. What can we pay attention to when simultaneously we are being bombarded by information? How can we discern what is important and what is irrelevant? This has become a real crisis. How can we take care of our attention? How can we look at something with more intensity and care? Indian traditions would diagnose this as a condition of Vikṣepa, that is scatteredness, dispersal and loss of inward anchoring. That means, what is at stake here is not merely productivity, but the very possibility of selfhood, because without regulated attention the mind becomes available to every passing impulse, trend, outrage and anxiety. So, the problem is the problem of concentrating on something that is valuable, that is important. The attention is so scattered, so dispersed that concentrating on something and getting a right perspective about it is always very challenging. So, in this sense, mindfulness becomes a philosophical and even ethical necessity. You ask anybody and they will say practice mindfulness. What will this do? This will regulate your wavering attention. This will help you collect yourself. This will help you maintain your attention. So, this is the recovery of the capacity to inhabit one's own awareness rather than live in permanent cognitive outsourcing. Well friends, how many times we spend time with our own self? I keep asking this to myself, to my students and whosoever I know. I always say, did you spend even 2 minutes with yourself? Because 2 minutes of time spending with the self helps us understand who we really are, what is important in our life. We are so bombarded by things that are unnecessary, yet find a place in our memory, cognition and life that we have hardly any time to know ourselves, to know the true nature of ourselves, to know what is expected of us, what is important for us, what is valuable for us. So, rather than living in this state of permanent cognitive outsourcing, it is very important to inhabit our own awareness, and that is why mindfulness is so important. Now, when we talk about mindfulness, this has also become a buzzword, lot of people are selling it, but how do we understand it? What is the real meaning of it? That it just control our wavering thoughts, gives us some kind of peace of mind or calm. Is that all that mindfulness means? No. Mindfulness in Indian traditions is far richer than the popular simplification of living in present. Lot of people say it gives you an opportunity, or rather it enables you to live in the present, and that means you are not troubled by your past thoughts. But then is that all? No. Whether in Buddhist, sati or smriti, yogic ekagrata, or Vedantic Sākṣibhāva, the emphasis is on a disciplined mode of awareness that remembers itself while experience unfolds. The Sati Pathan framework, which we talked about in the last lecture as well, which comes from Buddhistic framework, calls this the presence of mindfulness, where awareness remains near body, feeling and mind without being swept away by them. You experience everything, you are responsive to everything, but at the same time you are also aware of your own self. Your own self is not lost in the tumult of the happenings all around. The philosophical subtlety here is crucial. Mindfulness is not passive noticing, but non-fusional awareness. It is not about closing your eyes, trying to bring your attention to the middle of your forehead, concentrating on one thing and believing that you have practiced mindfulness and you are feeling calmer. No, it is much more than that. Thought arises, but I am not reducible to thought. Emotion arises, but I need not become its immediate servant. Impulse appears, but awareness can still decide. So, this distinction gives mindfulness its transformative power. It interrupts the collapse of consciousness into content. So, it is not about suppressing your emotions, that is not possible. Impulse will be there, emotions will be there, things will happen to you. So, you cannot completely ignore them, but then mindfulness teaches us how to train our mind and consciousness to look at things in the right perspective and take them in the right context. Well, Citta-vṛtti-nirodha, you might have heard about this is very popular. It is from Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, which defines yoga. Yoga means, in the common man's understanding, yoga means joining something. So, what are we talking about through yoga? It is an ancient Indian practice which is very much relevant and effective in practicing mindfulness. This has been so beautifully explained in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra through this definition, Yoga Citta-vṛtti-nirodha. Yoga is the regulation of the fluctuations of consciousness. The phrase Citta-vritti does not simply refer to thoughts in a narrow cognitive sense. It points to the entire field of mental modifications, memories, anticipations, projections, emotional rehearsals, imaginal constructions, sensory residues, self-narratives and interpretive loops through which consciousness continually moves. So, movement itself is not the problem. Issue begins when this natural movement loses proportion and becomes self propelling compulsion. So, you are going to be governed by memories, anticipations, projections, emotional rehearsals, sensory residue, self narratives. But then would you allow them to take control of yourself, or would you allow them to sow in regulated proportion? Now, that is going to be important. So, Nirodha does not mean violent suppression or repression or blankness or the denial of the thought. We cannot violently suppress it. In the yoga practices, the yoga gurus never ask you to put pressure on your mind. Try to suppress your feelings, control your emotions. No, they ask us to do that naturally. So, Nirodha is the restoration of measure to mental movement. It is the capacity to prevent the mind from endlessly continuing a movement long before the event itself had passed. It controls the Citta-vṛtti, that is the fluctuations of our mind. Fine. It asks us to let it pass, put a control, put a ceiling on that and move ahead. The problem is not that the mind moves. The problem is when movement becomes compulsion. Our mind has a tendency to think, and this thinking process will never stop. But then which kind of thought is to be allowed, to what extent? If we learn to regulate that, certainly we have practiced mindfulness. This distinction is especially valuable in contemporary contexts such as insomnia, overthinking after breakups, panic before public speaking, career uncertainty, and the endless recursive loops of social media comparison. More than any other time, we are suffering from such menace. Insomnia, half of the world is taking sleeping pills. Lot of people have problem with their sleep. Lot of people fall prey to overthinking if something goes wrong with them. Many of us have become addicts of social media. Social media comparisons, they are taking to our health, our mind, our wealth, everything. Well, long back I remember when we were growing up, there was a very popular advertisement, "Uski साड़ी मेरी साड़ी से सफ़ेद कैसे." Now, this comparison has taken gigantic proportions now. Why somebody has 1,000,000 followers, why I do not have even 1,000? Why somebody is getting some number of likes, I am not getting any likes? This has also become one of the biggest challenges for us, and this is so unsettling. The modern mind often mistakes repetitive mental activity for problem solving, when in reality it is only sustaining psychic turbulence. We are always overwhelmed by thought, always deep in thought, and we believe that we are behaving like wise people. We are problem solving, but no, problem is not solved by thinking it without an end, but thinking smartly. And thinking smartly requires your mind to be sharp, to be free from any kind of negative thoughts or competing thoughts. This also critiques how is productivity culture, how in our productivity culture thinking is often romanticized as seriousness, and constant mental occupation is mistaken for engagement. You might have heard about people busy without work. There are some people who always pretend to be busy, but in fact their productivity is zero. So, just showing that your mind is always preoccupied, you are always thinking, and that is why you are productive, is a facade. So, Indian philosophy asks a more difficult question. It says, is the mind moving toward insight or merely suckling its own momentum? Now, this is very important. If I am really walking, am I making any progress in the real sense? Does that lead to more wisdom? Does that lead to more insight? Does that lead to more maturity? If I am ending where I started, I have not made any progress. So, believing that overthinking, imposed seriousness, spending long hours at work will only make you successful certainly is a farce. In the Indian tradition, breath, all of us know we are alive because we are breathing, but we simply take it as given. We never bother about where from the wind comes, how we inhale it, how we exhale it. This process goes on even when our mind stops working. We are not aware of it till there is some kind of problem with it. In Indian tradition, it is recognized, breathing is recognized as the most immediate bridge between body, mind and awareness. So, breath regulation through pranayama, pran means vayu, vayu means wind, breath, and yama, that is control. Through the regulation of breath, which is called pranayama, this is considered the earliest technology of self regulation because it directly affects the rhythm of our agitation. Fine. So, in Indian tradition, pranayama is considered one of the earliest ways to regulate one's body and mind. When the breath is irregular, the mind becomes narrative heavy. When the breath steadies, the mind regains proportion, and that is why we are asked to practice it, concentrate on the way we are exhaling and inhaling, and through that we believe that we feel pleasure, we feel more calmness, we feel free from any kind of troubled thought. This is why practices such as Nadi Shodhan. What is this Nadi Shodhan? All of us know that the two nostrils represent two nadis. So, Chandraswar and Suryaswar we call it. There is one nostril through which we take the warm air and through the other we leave the cold air. So, one does the cooling, the other one does the warming, and their balance is what makes our body balanced and composed. Nadi Shodhan is also about counted breathing, elongated exhalation, and it remains even relevant in modern life. Lot of people will be found practicing Nadi Shodhan because it controls their BP, it controls the irregular beat of their heart, it controls their fleeting mind, and ultimately it saves them from lot of emotional, neurological and physiological problems. The critical insight here is breath creates embodied mindfulness before conceptual mindfulness. Well, you might have heard a healthy mind resides in a healthy body. So, through pranayama we cultivate a healthy body, and now that healthy body is capable of healthy thought. So, embodied mindfulness leads to conceptual mindfulness. So, it is relevant in contemporary uses like panic before presentations, interview stress, anger escalation, etc. So, these practices are very important and come very handy in controlling many aggressive situations in our life. Almost we come across these situations every day in our life. One of the most urgent contemporary critiques of mindfulness is that it is often reduced to a technique of private calm, a way of making individuals emotionally manageable while leaving the conditions that produce distress fundamentally untouched. Well, does mindfulness make us uncomplaining, unmindful of the situation that causes inner turmoil? If it does, then certainly it does not meet the objective. The objective is not to close our eyes to structural injustice, to close our eyes to impending doom. Rather, the idea here is to learn how to tackle them. So, in corporate culture, educational institutions and productivity driven environments, mindfulness is sometimes deployed as a tool to help people cope better with exploitative systems. Organizations organize such yoga sessions so that their employees, despite their exploitative practices, remain calm, do not agitate, fine. So, rather than to help them see those systems more clearly, in such cases mindfulness risks becoming not liberation, but adaptation to dysfunction. That is why I was asking you that simple question, whether mindfulness means ignoring the structural injustice. Will that be really worth it? No, mindfulness is about developing that kind of sense of perception or resilience through which such systemic dysfunction may be controlled and improved upon. Indian traditions offer a far more demanding and ethically responsible vision. Awareness is never treated as an end in itself. I am aware that institutional injustice prevails here. Is that an end? No. Certainly I have to take the next step. Now that I know that structural or institutional injustice is there, what do I do about it? It must remain inseparable from vivek, discernment, dharma, ethical rightness, karuna, responsibility toward suffering, and self restraint that does not collapse into passivity. Certainly it does not, mindfulness does not teach us to be completely detached from everything that is happening around us, but rather being more perceptive, more focused, more discerning of that. So, the point of mindfulness is not merely to reduce agitation, but to refine perception so that one can see more truthfully, choose more proportionately, and act more responsibly. This is why the central question of self regulation cannot remain, does mindfulness make me calm? The more philosophically serious question is, does mindfulness make my action wiser? That is why friends, I said that you do not have to take it as a superficial exercise that might give you temporary relief from your wavering mind, unless and until it brings about structural psychological philosophical changes in yourself. Certainly it has not really helped you. This distinction is crucial. Calmness by itself is morally neutral. A person may be calm and still participate in injustice, remain silent before exploitation, or use composure to preserve harmful power. There are a lot of people who will say, "Arey yaar, I do not go into that, I keep a distance, I do not lose my mind." Why? You do not have to lose your mind, but at least do something so that the system does not continue that exploitation or injustice. Is exploitative productivity culture, in exploitative productivity culture, mindfulness must question the normalization of constant availability, performance obsession, and self-worth tied exclusively to output. Unless you question it, nothing will change. The same applies to conflict situations and leadership contexts. A leader who remains calm but refuses moral accountability is not mindful in the deeper Indian sense. So, friends, mindfulness is not about practicing for external calm of the mind, but it goes deeper than that. It affects us cognitively, psychologically, and philosophically, and compels us to ask more sustained existential questions. A highly contemporary aspect of mindfulness and self-regulation is the ability to manage mental load before it becomes exhaustion. All of us know we are living in an era of information overload. Sometimes while talking about this to my student friends, I always say compare your mind to the brain of your computer. When it is full, its processing speed becomes very slow. Now at that point in time, you start searching for all those unnecessary files that are creating this kind of a problem. You delete them or reconfigure your program, and then it is again fast compared to its earlier slowness. Why? Because now it has some more space. Likewise, if we continue to keep everything in our mind, certainly this will lead to cognitive overcrowding. Self-regulation is less about controlling dramatic reactions and more about learning the discipline of mental economy. So, what is important for us? What should we bother about? What is irrelevant for us? Whatever is irrelevant to you, forget that. Delete that from your mind, and your mind will always be having space to work at a faster pace. Indian traditions offer subtle philosophical basis for this through ideas such as Aparigraha, non-hoarding, and intentional simplicity. Keep it simple, do not have a tendency to hoard. Fine. So, delete those unnecessary files from your mind that have a tendency to slow down your system. While usually applied to material possessions, the idea can be extended to consciousness itself. The mind too can accumulate more than it can meaningfully hold. That is why, friends, I said the unregulated mind is not always emotionally unstable, often it is simply overfilled. So, many a time the information overload or keeping unnecessary thought in your mind might also affect your decision making, your leadership, and your working capacity. Maybe you are emotionally stable, yet because of these reasons you might end up in a mess rather than being a smart professional. The critical insight is that accumulation is often mistaken for productivity. We always believe that having more and more possessions is a sign of prosperity, but in fact that turns out to be a constant source of problem, anxiety and stress. We assume that more resources, more notes, more saved material and more simultaneous commitments make us more prepared, while in reality they often fragment clarity and weaken depth. We take lot of work upon us, but unfortunately we do not do even a single work with some degree of commitment. In Hindi it is said, एक ही साध है सब सद है सब साधे सब जाए. What does that mean? If you concentrate on one thing at a time, probably you can take care of everything that comes after that. But if you try to do several things at the same time, probably you end up doing none of them to perfection. The mind begins to carry informational residue that consumes attention even when no active work is happening. Mindfulness here becomes the discipline of asking what truly deserves mental space. So, friends, I was asking you, keep asking yourself, what is worth remembering and what is worth forgetting? What needs your attention and what is gair jaruri, that is not required? If you can really make that out, you can always keep your mind free from thoughts that are not required. Self-regulation then includes the courage to simplify, closing unnecessary loops, reducing inputs, finishing before opening more, curating what remains cognitively active. So, the takeaway is simple but powerful. And what is that takeaway, friends? The mind does not suffer only from disturbance, it also suffers from congestion. Fine. And this congestion comes from information overload, overthinking, without knowing whether you will make use of some information, storing it in your mind. So, this kind of congestion or information overload or emotional awe always results in some kind of suffering and mental distress. So, friends, this is all. I hope I have been able to give you some insight into the nature of stress and taking care of that, and especially our Indian classical tradition provides a very important solution to this problem. So, through our traditional knowledge of a yoga, mindfulness, we can certainly neutralize much of our stress problems. So, this is the select bibliography. Thank you very much. I look forward to your company again. Thank you very much.